Hello everyone, welcome to National Science Week. IHMRI is really proud to be offering a series of webinars this week to celebrate science and the amazing research being done to improve health outcomes around Australia. If you are interested in visiting any online events going on around the nation this week, go to scienceweek.net.au and you'll see a whole range of different types of webinars or events open to all different age ranges around a variety of topics. So today's webinar though is on hormones, health and human connection. My name's Kate and I'm the Community Engagement and Events Coordinator here at IHMRI. I'd like to acknowledge the Dharawal people, the traditional custodians of the land on which IHMRI sits. I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging and extend that respect to Aboriginal people present on the webinar today. So today's webinar is focusing on hormones, health and connection. So how hormones can change and impact our health. Theresa will cover the important role that hormones play in affecting our mood and how human beings need to feel connected to feel the benefits of these hormones. Particularly in these current stressful times, we're all living through a pandemic, we're isolated in lockdowns. Are there ways that we ourselves can naturally increase oxytocin and improve our connectedness? So today I'd like to welcome Theresa, Dr. Theresa Larkin. Theresa is an academic in the University of Wollongong School of Medicine in a research and teaching capacity. Her main research focus is on hormones and mental and maternal health. Theresa teaches anatomy and physiology to UOW's medical students. So we really want this webinar to be as interactive as possible. So please feel free to use the Q&A section down in the bottom of the screen to post your questions that you might have throughout the webinar. We'll do our very best to get to all of the questions. If you have any comments or personal experiences that you'd like to share, we encourage you to use that chat function. And in case you're wondering, a recording of today's webinar will be available. It will be on IHMRI's website, ihmri.org.au, but I'll also email a copy round to everybody in the next few days. And just for those of you who don't know, the Illawarra Health and Medical Research Institute, better known as IHMRI, is a not-for-profit charity that supports health and medical researchers in the Illawarra Shoalhaven region of New South Wales. We bring scientists, doctors and health professionals together to solve our greatest health challenges through research. Then our scientists are working really hard to find better ways to prevent and treat disease and illnesses such as cancer, diabetes, mental health and dementia, just to name a few. If you'd like to have a look at the other research areas we work on, you can go to the website, that's ihmri.org.au. But for now, I think we're ready to get started, Theresa. So welcome.
Sounds good. Thank
Theresa,
you.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how and why you got into research and specifically research into hormones?
So I guess I didn't really know what I wanted to do when I was at school, but I did always like science. I also liked art and music, but I ended up doing a Bachelor of Science and a major and honours in chemistry. And I just found that through all the subjects I did, I was always drawn to those ones that were more based around humans and anatomy and physiology. So I did my honours project looking at soy foods and bioavailability and health in a human population. And then from there, I went into a PhD in biomedical science and I did similar studies. So loved it because it was all about human studies. And I guess the theme throughout is that I was always interested in hormones. I think because you can't see them. So it's some people at the conferences I go to with anatomy, you know, they're always surprised that I mostly teach anatomy, yet my interest in terms of the physiological system isn't just the heart or just muscle, it's hormones because they affect all of our tissues. So I think I really like variety. I really like people. So I like that hormones have effects. You know, they influence how we interact with people. They influence who we are. And they've also got changes, you know, over the course of a day, over the course of a month for a female having a menstrual cycle, over the course of a lifetime. So I think that they're, something that really keeps me interested. You're on mute, Kate.
How many webinars have I done already? Happens to the best of us. I was just going to say, Theresa, from the conversations that we've had in the lead up to prepping the content for this webinar, I've just been blown away at the amount of hormones that we've got floating around our body, and as you say, how it can differ from one day to the next, to the month, to a different year. It's just incredible. So yeah, sure, it gives you a lot of variety. So can you tell us a little bit about the role that hormones actually play in our body? Why are they so important?
So we've got hormones for so many different things. Sorry, everyone, I'm a bit of a mover. I stand when I'm presenting. So we have hormones that affect so many different things. But if we had to sort of classify, we'd say that they're mostly to do with growth, development, metabolism, reproduction, and survival. So that brings in where we have our stress hormones. They're present in our blood in tiny concentrations. So they get secreted by endocrine, which is essentially the word for hormone. So endocrine glands, tissues, different organs. And then they secrete these chemical messengers into the blood at tiny, tiny concentrations, like 10 to the minus 12, billions of a billionth of the concentration that we're used to. And then from there, they travel through the blood. And the definition of a hormone then is that it will have effects on tissues that are far from when it was made, from where it was made. So they travel through the bloodstream and then can affect other tissues. So I guess, there's just such variety in what they do. We would have heard of the reproductive hormones like testosterone and estrogen. We've got hormones that are important for growth, like thyroid hormone and growth hormone. Then we have, the hormones that are responsible for metabolism. So insulin, important for glucose. And then we think about the hormones that are essential for our survival because we come into contact with stress pretty much on a daily basis. Throughout our evolution, we had to deal with stressful situations. So in terms of that, we have especially adrenaline and cortisol.
Fantastic. And I guess those levels change all the time as well. Is that right?
Yeah. So it is interesting when you think about even across the course of a day, like through our evolutionary development and as humans, we're designed to be active in the daytime and then restful in the nighttime. So we have a diurnal cycle where we're active in light hours. And so the changes in hormones over a day are really about that. So one of the most prominent changes that people probably know about is that we have a real increase in cortisol just before our waking hours. So in the very early hours of the morning. And one of the big effects of cortisol is long-term. It's most important for ensuring that we have enough glucose supply. So our glucose is one of the main sources of an energy substrate for our organs, but especially for the brain. And so cortisol is all about mobilizing energy reserves. So that makes sense that it increases just before we wake up because the liver needs to already start making new glucose, considering we presumably haven't eaten for at least 8, 10, 12 hours from the previous night. So that sort of sets us up for the day. One of the other main hormones that fluctuates over the course of the day is melatonin, which is obviously important for our sleep. And it's stimulated by dark, which is super interesting to think something stimulated by the lack of light, but it is by the dark, that stimulates melatonin secretion. And that increases during the night so that we have our restful, night sleep where we have restorative processes. It does things like reduces insulin because it presumes that we're not eating throughout those darker night hours so that then we can have a settling of our digestive system. And then obviously we have, changes in the female hormones over a cycle. We have changes in the male hormones over the course of a lifetime. Lots of our hormones, they do also change, over the life.
And so they all talk to each other as well by the sounds of it then.
Mm-hmm.
They're all
yes, that's one of the things I think that I also really like is that, you can have something going on with thyroid hormone that ends up affecting the reproductive hormones.
Amazing. So to our audience, we do want to include you in this webinar. So we actually have a few polls. So Theresa, should I launch the first poll?
Yeah, I think if we do the first poll, sort of just warming up at the moment into our hormones. And Workventures is talking about how the stress we experience now is different to stress years ago. And that's very true, which I'm happy to touch on as we go through with that because it really relates into some of the mental health challenges.
Okay, so the first poll, let me just launch that. So hopefully you can all see that poll. We want to know what you think, which gland or organ produces the most hormones. So you click on which answer you think is correct: adrenal glands, the digestive tract, pituitary gland, skin, or testes and ovaries. So I'll just give you a few seconds to answer that question. Okay, so just another third of you to go, quarter of you to go. All right, 3, 2, 1. Let's end that poll.
A tricky one.
Share the results.
Oh, very
so
good.
that's what people think. Theresa, are they right?
That is perfect. It's beautiful because everything that's written up there does produce hormones. It's true that the pituitary gland produces the most hormones and the most variety of hormones. The adrenal glands definitely also produce, possibly in number, they might produce even more in actual number, but a lot of those are sort of metabolites that then get further converted. The digestive tract also secretes a lot of hormones. The testes and the ovaries, they do secrete testosterone and estrogen and progesterone, but that's obviously not, that's not a lot of hormones. So they're very specialized in terms of what they secrete. So I thought that I might even ask the audience, case, because they can type it in, if anyone knows what hormone, because it does, what hormone the skin secretes.
Any ideas, anyone?
While people are doing that, I guess I can just make the point that this is interesting in terms of all the research about the digestive tract, you know, the activity of the gut microbiome. The digestive tract does secrete hormones, and there can be that real talk between the gut and the brain.
And the question you want people to answer is, what hormone
wondering
people think the skin
secretes? Wondering if anyone knows.
Pop that into the chat function there. So Michael has guessed at vitamin D.
Yep. Actually, I love that work ventures put pheromones, because that's actually very true. The glands in the skin. But I was
didn't even know the skin release hormones.
Yes, yeah. The pheromones are those, you know, ones that we can smell from certain glands in the skin that are in our armpits and in our groin, and even like around the beard for males that have a beard. But the one that I was thinking of was vitamin D. So actually, vitamin D is made from a precursor that's based around cholesterol. And then our UV light will come in and convert that to vitamin D, which then has to still undergo steps in the liver and kidney. But I guess it's interesting because it is a vitamin, but the reason that it's also considered a hormone is because it does then travel through the blood and have effects at lots of different tissues and organs around the body. So it affects nearly every tissue in the body, vitamin D, which is a hormone.
So it really is vital. So all of us have enough vitamin D to be able to function at our optimum level.
Oh, and melanin, yes, that's true, Nikki. So yeah, rather than melatonin, melanin is also produced in the skin too. That's correct.
Okay, so melanin is the hormone that protects the skin, and melatonin is the sleep hormone.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yeah. And melanin's not necessarily a hormone; it's a pigment, I would say.
Okay, lovely. Oh, well, thanks everyone for participating in that.
Got a few more polls.
So we've all heard of hormones like testosterone and estrogen. Are these hormones produced continually by the body? And do they have like an ongoing long-term effect when hormones are continually being made by the body?
Yeah, I guess one of the most important concepts in terms about thinking of hormones in our health is that they're all kept in balance. And one of the main roles of hormones is homeostasis, which means same state. So we want to keep our body in a regulated state. So what happens with most hormones is that if we think back to the previous slide and those different glands that we had, so the pituitary gland will secrete a hormone that then stimulates the ovaries to produce estrogen, for example. When that changes over the month or over the lifetime, same with testosterone, what happens is that once that estrogen, as an example, is in the blood, it feeds back to the pituitary gland to say, okay, we've got enough in the blood now, just reduce your stimulation. So we have what's called negative feedback, where the levels of the endpoint hormone in the blood feed back to the stimulatory pathway, so that over the course of days, months, life, you know, we have the level that we need based on our demands. So we have that sort of a feedback. I guess that what happens is when things go wrong is when that feedback doesn't work so well. So I guess I wanted to ask a next question just for people's curiosity as well, is if they know what those hormones are made from. So we might put that poll up. Okay.
Yes, yeah. There we go.
And then we can talk about cortisol as well.
Yes, I saw that question about cortisol, so we'll definitely get to that one. But for now, if I can ask everyone to answer this question, what are hormones made of? What is used as the building blocks for the reproductive hormones such as testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, and the stress hormone cortisol? So we've got amino acids, cholesterol, fatty acids, glucose, and protein. What does everybody think? Oh, it's pretty even. A minute. All right, I'll just give you a few more seconds, everyone.
The last responses were perfect because there was something for everything, but in the exact, you know, most to least.
Yeah. All right, I'll end the poll now and share the results. Can you talk us through the results, Theresa, there?
Yes. So very good split here. Goodness, if you're in a class, I'd be like, I think you should talk to the person about what you think is right. So in terms of the building blocks for the reproductive hormones and the stress hormone cortisol, that's actually cholesterol. So cholesterol is very important in terms of all of our hormones that are fat soluble, because if we think about cholesterol, it itself is a fat essentially. And so those hormones like testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, and cortisol, they're all fat soluble hormones that can then go right into cells and have more longer term and long lasting effects. So I thought it was a nice way to exemplify that. Whereas amino acids, which is what most people have chosen, and they do come from protein, they're actually the building blocks for pretty much all the other hormones. So I kind of just asked about these reproductive hormones and cortisol, but the amino acids are the building blocks for lots of our other hormones that have more, like they have quicker effects and shorter lived effects. So there's quite a distinction between those ones that are made from cholesterol. They can be, you know, they can be soluble in fat and they have our longer lasting effects like we think of with reproduction and cortisol. Whereas amino acids make up things like insulin. We just want insulin to work quite quickly and then drop back down. And then also the amino acids are what make the hormone oxytocin, which is my favorite hormone. And that's what one of the sort of, you know, the features of what we'll talk about today. Before we go to oxytocin, I just thought I'd mention, because it was spoken about before with cortisol and talking about the feedback. So one of the things that is thought to contribute to depression and other mental health issues like that is when there's an ongoing increase in stress, and this cortisol that's meant to just sort of go up and down in a day. We have stresses every day and we're meant to be physically active. We're meant to, you know, have those physical stresses like the person on the line said. But when we have ongoing stresses, and especially say like, you know, things where we're preoccupied or something, and then what can happen is that instead of feeding back to say, okay, we've got enough cortisol, turn your signals off, that gets out of hand. So there's never this signal to stop the cortisol. So then the cortisol will increase and increase. So it can be a dysregulation of that feedback. Oxytocin is the perfect antidote to cortisol and stress though. So I think that's maybe where we can go to next.
Excellent. I will launch. Should I launch that poll now?
Or maybe I should mention.
Sorry, go on.
No, what were you going to say?
I was going to say, did you want to tell us a little bit more about oxytocin?
Yeah, I think maybe nice to introduce oxytocin. So oxytocin is what people might think of or have heard of as the feel-good hormone. So it's described as a pro-social hormone. So it's all really about human connections, interactions, you know, all of those bonding. We think of it as a hormone of bonding. So thought then we might put the next poll question up and see exactly what people think about what kind of bonding that's involved in.
Okay. So So what are the main roles of oxytocin? So is it mother-child bonding, social bonding between individuals, mother-child bonding and social bonding between people? Oh, hopefully, can you all see the fourth one? Are there? Mother-child bonding, social bonding between some people, and exclusion of others. What does everybody think there? Give you a few more seconds to answer that poll. Okay, let's end that poll and share those results. Can you all see those results? Yep.
Yes.
So Theresa, talk us through that. 68% think mother-child bonding and social bonding between people. They're not wrong.
No, that's very right. But then also it is actually the last one where, like, I'm not surprised that this is exactly what people think. It's a very difficult kind of tricky question. But yeah, so definitely we think of oxytocin as mother-child bonding, social bonding between people, but it can play a role in terms of some in-group versus out-group. So there can be an antisocial aspect. The way that researchers describe the roles of oxytocin is that it's tend, befriend, and defend. So one of the main roles of oxytocin that people would know about is in that maternal infant bonding. So it's really important for the mother as well as the child. They even think that the oxytocin released during childbirth can help with some of those real sort of the immune hit and the inflammatory hit on the baby. But obviously it's super important in terms of having that connection between a mother and a newborn. Oxytocin increases in both parents or caregivers, you know, especially in that first 6 months of life. And I'm sure we've all experienced that oxytocin hit with a newborn, whether it's yours or someone close to you, you know, that there's just this real innate sense of a positivity and well-being. Then in terms of so that's the tend. Then in terms of and I suppose as part of the tend, oxytocin is also stimulated and involved in romantic partnerships, especially early on. And all of these things are because this is about our survival as a species. So we need to be together. It's beneficial for humans to live in groups. You know, a village is needed to raise a child. We want people around so that we have the best chance for survival of our young ones and continuation of our species. So then in terms of the befriending, so even though we might just think of oxytocin as maternal infant and, you know, lovers, it's still super important for people in general. So for bonding with friends and family, colleagues, with strangers, you know, any kind of an interactive experience, oxytocin plays a role. It works with dopamine, which is our reward hormone, in terms of helping with motivation to be with people and then the reward that we get from being with them. So oxytocin is stimulated when we have all of those really nice, you know, connections and interactions. When we think about the defend aspect, the example they often use in the literature is about the mama bear. You know, like a mama bear has had, like an actual bear, had her new little cubs, and she just wants to, you know, tend to those, befriend her family. If someone comes onto, you know, her land, everyone's experienced with animals, possibly humans, animals, where that animal is absolutely going to defend against her immediate clan. So there is also a role for oxytocin in that initial defense part. So sometimes people say that it also has antisocial properties, but that's only really relevant on the context. So it only becomes sort of an antisocial hormone when there is a context of threat or when there might be an impingement in trust, because oxytocin is all about trust as well.
More of like a protective measure.
Mm-hmm.
And from an evolutionary perspective, then, what's the impact of oxytocin and social bonding?
Yeah, so humans were meant to, you know, survive and thrive in groups. It's how we've developed. It's how we've, you know, become the population that we are. And so one of the things that oxytocin did early on in our evolution, actually one of the things that I didn't realize this until I read this recently, is that also in terms of its role in childbirth, it allowed, because it's important for then the uterine contractions and getting the baby out of the pelvic canal, obviously all of like as just one of the influences for that, it enabled us to have a bigger head for bigger brains. So it's sort of a part of that. But what it did is that it enabled groups to work together. So it enabled people to stay together, to, originally, like, many millions of years ago or however many years ago, when we were hunting in groups, so that needed to be a communal activity. Survival was obviously enhanced in a group situation. And then something that's really relevant to the COVID pandemic is that our evolution and growing in groups also helped with the development of our immune systems. So the more we interact with others, we do get exposed to different germs and viruses and things. And so in early days when there were, smaller hunter-gatherer groups, then oxytocin is a good thing because it's a little bit protective for coming into contact with other people. It's actually beneficial to have our immune systems shared, to mate with someone with a different immune system, because it builds a more robust immune system in the offspring. But what happened in those early days when people were sort of in very small or smaller groups than today, and they might meet with another small group, there's a risk that there's new germs that your immune systems are not used to, just because of where they grew up, different environments, different trees and plants and animals will produce different viruses and things like that. So when this started happening of people coming together, there were increases in the cortisol levels because it was a stress situation. But cortisol, and Claire had asked this before, so ongoing cortisol causes effects like a reduction in our immune health, inflammation, but initially it's there to prime us. And so that actually wants to initially release inflammatory markers and things like that in case we're going to get sick and we need to fight off this infection. Having oxytocin stimulated as well when we come into contact with others is protective for that, so that people learn that they can come into contact with someone new. Maybe you need to be prepared to have a response to new germs, but then it's okay, and oxytocin comes in and it dampens that response. So oxytocin was all about thriving together in groups and then expanding that and connecting with others, having trust that these other humans who might have looked a little bit different, and it still happens in today's world, doesn't it? Someone who looks a bit different, acts a bit different, wears clothes that are a bit different. Oxytocin helps us to trust that they're still human, and we can trust that those differences will actually benefit us.
And so I guess, and we hadn't discussed this prior, but it's just occurred to me. So those people that you meet and you think, oh, I'm not sure what their intentions are, is that oxytocin firing up, going, oh my God, I'm not sure about this person, perhaps, take a step back? Or is that, I'm just thinking about, I don't know if you get, we say that, oh, I got bad vibes off that person. Is that anything to do with hormones?
Yes, so definitely oxytocin will increase trust in others. And so that is a good thing. Like the other hormones where you're a bit sort of worried about someone, probably still, maybe that's when we get a drop in our oxytocin and we notice that, oh, hang on a minute, I'm not getting this good vibe that I expect when I meet with somebody else. So yeah, but oxytocin in general is all about having an increased trust and being able to trust others. So they've done experiments where they will give people, because you can have oxytocin intranasally, you can spray up your nose. And so they've done experiments where they've done that with people and then given them money in a pretend game, and they find that people are more giving and they're more trusting when they've got more oxytocin.
Wow. Gosh, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Great. Is there anything else you want to cover on the immune system and the effects of oxytocin?
I guess
in terms of synchronization and sensory stimulation, we spoke a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I guess in terms of the immune system, super interesting that there's been a few papers out at the moment looking at oxytocin as one of the potentials for COVID, because oxytocin is an anti-inflammatory. They're looking in those people who have that really high inflammatory response with the COVID virus, who are affected, whether that's something that can help. But I guess it's a real, paradoxical situation in this pandemic, because we've got social isolation, we're separate from each other. And so we're not getting those normal interactions, and we are meant to live in groups. Even when someone lives in a household, like they've looked at different chimpanzee families in zoos, and even if there's a family of chimpanzees, a father and a mother and some kids, and they've got all the food they want and they've got shelter, if they don't have access to their friends and the larger group, they will get aggressive, and they will, they are not happy, and they will have some health issues. So social isolation isn't good for us health-wise. But some of the things, and this goes back to the evolutionary perspective, that increase oxytocin, I think of it as synchronization and sensory stimulation. So in terms of the synchronization, when humans were developing language and things like that, there was lots of singing, humming, chanting. So all of these things, and vocalization was a really important part in our development and to develop language. And people did that together. There's a huge bonding in people doing things together. And even, in COVID, when there were the images of all of I think it was in the States where people were coming out and clapping at 7 p.m. every day for the nurses, and in Europe where you saw people singing together on the balconies. Anytime we do things with other people at the same time really increases our oxytocin. So things like humming, singing, laughing, even dancing, especially making music, that's got a really high emotional effect. Then all of those things can actually increase our oxytocin. I read that in some African dialects, the word for song and music is pretty much the same. So it kind of shows you that those things, go together. And I guess I was even thinking about this. I was going to look up exactly, Claire, festivals and concerts. Oh my gosh, I was actually thinking about that this morning. How good is it to do a Mexican wave at a big event? Like, how good is it when everyone's listening to the same song? Like everyone's chanting or doing this, like such a height, such a lift. And so I think it's great that we're still able to do things like that online. And another thing that I was thinking of that's obviously relevant to recent events is sports and the Olympics, and, being like barracking for a team and that sort of, bonding together is really important. But I also noticed that this year they had a lot of extra team events in the sports. So, they even had a team triathlon, and where it was male, female, something like that. And then they had, the team relays in the swimming.
Yeah.
And I think, all of those things, like the competing with someone or sharing, or even the actual race and racing, like all of those things have been really important in increasing our oxytocin.
Working together to shared.
Yeah.
To achieve.
And even if you
outcome.
think how good is it even when you sing happy birthday with a group of people and all clap hands together?
Sometimes awkward in an office situation, but on the whole, it's a lovely thing to do. You're right.
And then the other aspect, is the sensory stimulation. So one of the main things that also can stimulate oxytocin is physical touch. And it doesn't have to be a sexual touch or romantic, any touch can stimulate oxytocin. And obviously that's what we're really missing at the moment. So, the lack of people being able to hug or even shake hands, I hope that it's something that goes back to how it was before when we're through this, because I think it will take some adjusting for people. And obviously not everybody likes that, and that's fine. But so any kind of a touch is really important. I guess in the current situation, that actually includes patting a pet, or maybe someone else's pet. So a pet, and even, like as silly as it sounds, the research shows that if you have a nice blanket or a nice pillow that you like that feel of, that actually can also increase oxytocin. And that's a good example of that in terms of, again, sort of from animal studies and evolutionary. There's some famous studies that people would know about with looking at monkeys, or I can't remember what particular monkey or chimpanzee it was. Sorry to those in psychology who would know this so well. Although it would have been rhesus monkeys, I'm sure. So they took them, when they took the babies from their mother, they put two different surrogate mothers in the cage, and one was just made of wire, but it had food. So it had whatever food the baby rhesus monkey needed. And another one that was just nice and fluffy and cuddly, but it didn't give them food. And the monkeys still really preferred this fluffy, cuddly one over the one that was giving them food, or they might quickly get food and come back and spend all their time with the cuddly one. So all of us, any sort of physical touch and texture is also really beneficial.
Gosh, it's just really highlighting why everyone's feeling a bit flat, a bit low through this. We still have, and I'm sure lots of you on social media, and you'll see, it's not so bad. We still have food, we still have a house to live in, we still have the luxuries that, but the lack of social connection can really play havoc with our health and with how we're feeling.
And that's right, Catherine saying, yes, cabarets, muggy. And then who doesn't want to be singing and dancing and laughing together? And the weighted blankets, I've actually been thinking about that myself. Like, I do think that that's a role for them.
Yeah, it's just amazing.
So maybe we can ask people, oh, sorry, what were you going to?
No, you carry on.
I was thinking if we do the poll about, are we on to the fourth poll?
We are, yeah.
Yes. And ask people about their favorite forms of communication and how we can think about that and oxytocin in this pandemic.
So I'll launch that now. So can you let us know, what is your preferred form of communication? So is it in person, face-to-face? Would it be video, Skype, online chat, so you can see the other person as well as hear them? Or is it just talking on the phone where you hear the person's voice? Or is it email or text message? Or indirect comments, for example, over social media? What's your preferred method of communicating?
And this is obviously just an interest poll. There's no correct answer.
No, that's right. That's right. Okay, I will end that poll there and share the results. Unsurprisingly, for me, in-person, face-to-face, 85% of you prefer in-person, face-to-face contact.
And I guess this comes back to, again, through evolution, our verbal communication and voice and non-verbal and seeing others is huge. That is how we can really connect. There's more to every interaction than the words that are seen or are heard in an audio message. So when I talk about this, I'm very aware that, there are people who are visually impaired or have hearing impairment or are mute. And so when we think about this as a whole, though, a message where we either just read something or it's just an audio, you can quickly leave an audio message and that's in the person listens. There's no real connection with that. So it's like what we had on the list. It's almost like then there's a hierarchy. So words alone, they're good for getting a message across, but they won't really increase our oxytocin necessarily. I mean, I suppose sometimes they can if they're great. So the next best thing is that in this current pandemic, the more that people can use voice, and even though it seems sometimes probably just so much easier to text, the benefits of being able to speak to someone on the phone or to have, a visual and audio as well, or a phone and an audio, it makes a real big difference in terms of your oxytocin and being able to share. Having a video conference where you can, it's not the same, you don't really have eye contact, but you can almost have eye contact and tell that people are watching and listening. Even differences of, breaking it up and maybe not always reading the news, but listening to the radio or watching the TV, even though they're not people you're connecting with, it still actually stimulates those parts of the brain. Obviously, the best is to be in person. And so, I think the more in this COVID pandemic that can happen, obviously within the constraints of restrictions and things, even if it's at a distance and you're waving to someone or you're seeing someone, every little bit will count. I guess.
Cumulative as well.
What's that?
Like in a day, is it cumulative? So is there a certain amount of oxytocin we need to feel good and for our bodies to work as needed? Can you accumulate that throughout the day and then you're back to zero on the next day?
It's one of those things like, it will sort of help us, but one of the good things about oxytocin, and this is why it's important, in that maternal infant bonding, is that it can set up pathways and wiring in our brains. It can set up our response to stresses and our resilience and things like that. So the more that we do, keep on building those experiences and building connections and having those oxytocin bursts, it is changing things in our brain. It's changing pathways, and that can help. Whereas I guess the opposite side of that, which totally applies to most people in this pandemic, there are stresses in the pandemic that are sort of among the worst stresses when they classify them. They classify stresses as those things that require a major upheaval, or that's really out of your control, or where you feel like you've got demands that you can't meet. Pretty sure everybody can sort of understand that at this time. And so if we've just got this cortisol and this stress level that's rising and rising, and we're not sort of just having an increase in cortisol, doing some activity and it drops back down, the problem with that is that it will increase our responsiveness to when we get a quick hit of an adrenaline hit. Like, one thing annoys you and then you're absolutely more reactive because your cortisol levels are high and they're priming that response. So the other thing that oxytocin can do is to try and dampen that. So the more that we can sort of have those connections, the more it will help.
There's some great comments coming through. Thank you, everyone, for sharing your experiences. Particularly Suzanne, she said, makes sense that after 8 weeks in isolation, while I'm craving hugs and face-to-face interaction, I do daily walks and have been feeling overwhelmed with the need to hug people. I couldn't agree more, Suzanne. I think when last year when we were first in isolation and in a lockdown, when I would meet someone, out walking the dog, and I'd meet someone, and my instinct was to go and give them a hug, and it just felt really wrong that we weren't able to do that.
And there are issues with, ongoing physical deprivation. It can be associated with a lower immune system and increased in depression. So it's just, and again, with the lower immune system, well, then that means you're more susceptible to viruses and things. So this pandemic is just such a, crazy situation in terms of the challenges that it puts on everybody. And I guess for people to know that those challenges are real in terms of our physiological responses. So, and someone was asking about, Catherine, the cortisol. So we've really got this imbalance at the moment in general. Overall, we're susceptible in this situation to an imbalance. So I guess it's understanding that we do have changes going on. And so, that's a lot to do with, the role of the hormones.
So you think, Catherine mentioned that, she's noticed that people are angrier than pre-pandemic. Is that, it's anecdotal, obviously. Could that be an outcome of increased cortisol and not enough oxytocin?
Yep, exactly. And like Claire said before, and Margie, about those activities where you're together, they're great stress releases, as people know. You can come off those, you're coming back, you're walking with 25,000 other people all going to the same train station to get the train home after a concert or whatever. And so we're not getting those same stress reliefs that we're used to and that we crave. So it's absolutely part of the reason, unfortunately.
And Emily asks, is there any truth to introverts versus extroverts into who's dealing with the lockdown better? So I know some introverts are quite happy not to have face-to-face connection all the time. Would they perhaps be dealing with this better?
I imagine so, and because most people then would know what are the things that they can do to even increase their own oxytocin level without realizing it. So I know one of my friends said that he liked the last lockdown better because he was still living on his own, and at the moment he's living with his partner, but he because he loves to be on his own at night and put music on and dance. And so without realizing it though, he's still connecting, and that's his way. He might be more of an introvert, but he's doing that. And so, there's lots of different ways that we can do, that we can connect. And I definitely think that introverts versus extroverts would be affected differently.
In terms of, so I know even when we did the poll just then, still 10% people said that they actually preferred communicating by email or text message. Is it physiologically from person to person, their makeup is that to function at a healthy level, they need lower levels of oxytocin, therefore don't feel the need to meet somebody face to face, so they're quite happy to send an email or a text message? Is that how it works?
Yeah, everyone does have, their different levels and their different need for connectedness, I suppose. just on that, I've just been thinking of some research. So with Dr. Susan Thomas, who is a clinical psychologist, and her and I have done research together on different hormones, and she's built a larger research group to do that even more so. And one of our earlier studies, we found that also people who have low oxytocin were less likely to seek their friends to sort of connect with. So it's kind of a bit of a bad situation then, like a negative cycle, where those who really would benefit from human interactions are kind of pulling away from it. And I'm sure we've all experienced that time when you're feeling down or you don't want to go out with people and you're like, oh, I just need to stay home. But then if you do, the benefits will usually, if you're with the right people, even if you start out, not being sure if you should be there, often they're the times that we benefit the most.
I'm sure everybody can relate to that. Sure. So people commenting about solo dance parties, amazing.
Oh yeah, I am all for a solo dance party.
People missing colleagues while working from home. I know lots of people are struggling a little bit with that. There's a comment here about increasing chronic pain. We encourage social activity and connectedness to counteract the long-term cortisol that stress produces, and in turn increases the pain response. That's a great point, that people who are in pain, perhaps it gets worse if they aren't able to connect with people, or the perceived pain.
So true. And I hadn't thought about that before, but in terms of then like the physical activity will increase oxytocin, but also oxytocin does have some, and look, I don't know how much to quantify it or anything, but it does have some anti-inflammatory effects. And so if inflammation is part of that chronic pain, then that also could be a part of it. How is oxytocin measured?
That's a great question.
So you can measure it in plasma. You can also, so in the, the liquid part of our blood, and we do that with our studies all of the time. You can also measure it in urine, you can measure it in saliva, and just knowing that you can measure it in saliva is an indication of how it gets processed and moved around the body, and it's in all of our tissues. So the most reliable measure would be plasma, at a certain time or before or after a certain event. People use urinary measures of hormones as more of a ongoing gauge, I guess you could say. So a lot of the time when people measure urinary cortisol, they do it over an entire 12-hour period or an entire 24-hour period, where the person collects their urine that whole time, and then the researcher will just take a small amount, because that then accounts for the fact that we're going to have some ups and downs in the day. So it gives us a measure of what's going on in that body over the whole day.
We do have a question here from Nikki, just back to cortisol, and you may have answered parts of this question, but she wants to know, why is too much cortisol bad for us, and what areas of the body does this impact on?
So the problem with ongoing cortisol is that its role. So I guess this happens all the time when we have a hormone that has its nice little role, but then if it's ongoing, it can be too far. So in terms of cortisol's role, it is to increase the mobilization of glucose when we need that. But ongoing, and also to have a bit of an inflammatory burst, because it's like, oh my goodness, stress. But our body thinks stress, as someone said earlier on, is just going to be, oh my goodness, that tiger's right there. No, it's not. It's okay. Up, down, like stress of hunger, but then you're going to eat, stress of being woken up in the night, but you go back to sleep. So we're used to having stresses or a big run, and evolutionary to get food. But the problem is that then long term, because cortisol thinks we're still under stress, we're still under stress, we're still under stress, it starts to release the glucose from other places. So it will break down fat, it will break down muscle, because it's like, well, we don't need that energy stored, we need it to be circulating. It can even reduce things like our reproductive function, because if it's like, well, we're so stressed, we don't have energy for reproduction. And then also another aspect of our body that requires energy is our immune system. So too much cortisol over a long period of time, same thing. It says, well, I don't have energy to have an immune response. I just need to survive right now on this and this moment and this day. And so people would know that, so corticosteroids, which is a form of the cortisol and steroids, they're used for things like, inflammation. So they can be used in asthma, and or an autoimmune response, and then they can be used in like, topical dermatitis and things like that. So overall, cortisol is not good because it's put us into an imbalance in terms of how we use our energy, and it's essentially just prioritizing just what we need right now for increased glucose, but that's against a threat that's not real at that moment.
Claudia mentioned earlier, asked, would continuous increased cortisol be involved in the appearance of autoimmune diseases?
It could be so a lot of the times, I guess, autoimmune normally comes from, definitely stress. Yes. So this is one of the links between stress and immune. You're more stressed, immune function's going down, you get sick. Autoimmune, I'm honestly not sure. I couldn't answer that question straight off about cortisol, but so happy to have a look and post back later, Kate, if you want.
Yeah, lovely,
but the thing with stresses and with autoimmune is that another thing that can also affect autoimmune are things like viruses. So anytime that, and maybe someone will be able to answer that question on the chat, by the way, about cortisol and autoimmune. So not sure about autoimmune exactly. It wouldn't surprise me because it's affecting the immune system, but an autoimmune is normally a misdirected immune response, not necessarily a lower or a higher one. So it's normally when our immune system mistakes a virus or something that's normal, like an allergen or something, as something that might attack us. And then it starts to set up defense cells against our own tissues. It thinks, oh, hang on a minute, that virus that I just needed to attack, now it thinks my thyroid looks like that virus. And so it starts to attack my thyroid. Yeah. So it's a little bit more of a complex situation.
Catherine has asked, can being in the natural environment increase oxytocin even if we're by ourselves? For example, going on a bushwalk, a swim, barefoot in the grass, or hugging a tree. Do those kind of activities increase that oxytocin levels?
I'm sure they would, because even of the sensory stimulation. And, and if we think back to our evolution, a part of this, or a part of our daily life was out in nature, and we were made to be physically active and outdoors. And so I have no doubt that also the things that she's mentioned, that includes physical stimulation and sensory touch. So, and heightened experiences of, and maybe even when you can hear birds, singing together or listening, I'm sure that all of those things would increase oxytocin.
Yeah. And Margie wonders, is there such a thing as a normal oxytocin level? We talked earlier about how it can be measured. Should, as human beings, we all have an optimum level of oxytocin?
So there's a range, like with a lot of hormones, there's a range that would be considered normal and healthy. In the studies that Sue and I have done, and then in collaboration with others. So we've actually found it was pretty much almost exactly half the level of oxytocin in depressed versus non-depressed individuals, and almost exactly double the cortisol. It was almost like it was almost just too exact to, it was almost an exact sort of half.
Yeah, wow.
One thing that's interesting is that in then some of the research I've done looking during pregnancy is that the women later in pregnancy had cortisol levels that were similar to the depressed participants. So they had higher cortisol levels, but their oxytocin levels were also higher. So similar to the non-depressed participants. So it's a really interesting physiological example of where a woman who's pregnant needs cortisol to be increasing later in her pregnancy. It's thought to be one of the stimulants, what's the right word? One of the sort of initial instigators of, exactly, for birth. But obviously that would not be good for her health to have that. So it's like the increased oxytocin is a buffer for it. And then obviously an increased oxytocin level is also essential at birth time. So there are normal ranges of oxytocin, and then lots of things will cause variations with that.
I just got this one last question here. So again, with ASD, does oxytocin increase with stimming, which helps calm down, for example, rubbing certain textures?
That's actually a really interesting question, which I haven't thought about before, but there has been a lot of research looking at oxytocin in autism spectrum disorders. And that's because of the role that oxytocin has in trust, but also, I didn't mention this word before, but in empathy. So people have looked at oxytocin in autism, in schizophrenia, in lots of different scenarios. But that's actually super interesting, Catherine's question, to think that possibly, like having that stimulation and a sensory stimulation might be something that's really important and innate in someone who may have lower oxytocin levels. That may be a way that they realize innately can increase it. Very interesting.
Yeah. Okay, we're almost out of time, Theresa. I was wondering, and I have so many more questions that I would love to ask you, but we just don't have time. Can you give us some takeaways for us, during this time, for us just to help keep us healthy and keep those oxytocin levels high?
Well, I thought, is this working, Katie, if I share my screen? Can you see that screen?
Yeah. You might just need to put it
on the big
perfect.
screen.
Yeah.
Like that. Yeah.
Lovely.
So I thought I'll just finish with some last little slides. So to say that, in our nature, humans have survived and thrived by bonding in social networks. This current COVID pandemic, isolation and social distancing, but I do prefer to call it physical distancing, like other people have said, because it doesn't mean we have to be socially distanced. But physical distancing, they're really a challenge to our social nature, to our connectedness, and to our relationships. So during social isolation, which now it is social isolation because we are, literally stuck in our own homes and things, the ways that we can stay connected include, like I said, I think about sensory stimulation and synchronization. So in terms of sensory stimulation, we're thinking vocal communication and affection, because this is what we evolved to thrive with. So seeing a face, hearing a voice, patting a pet, all those steps up from just, say, sending text messages or being quite isolated by choice. In synchronization, you can refer to that as mirroring and matching with others. So it's really important that, it's so beneficial to sing, to dance, to laugh, any kind of music, whether that's just you, yourself, and the radio, whether it's you and others, there's lots of online things, even laughing. So comedy is also really good, because when you laugh and if you're laughing with others, then it also makes you feel connected. But any of those things, maybe we should instigate a new clapping session or something each day where people just go out and start to clap in general.
That sounds great. And I'll share those last slides with the group afterwards in just a follow-up email. Gosh, you guys have been amazing today. So many comments and questions. Thank you so much for dialing in today. I think we had around 70 people at one time. That was our top number, which is fantastic. We really appreciate you dialing in. And Theresa, I know we had so many more questions to go through, but we really, really appreciate you sharing your research with us and also giving us tips and tricks and to better cope with the lockdown, and also giving us some of the background around why we're feeling how we're feeling. So that was really, really interesting. Thank you so much, Theresa.
Thank you.
We do, just to finish off, we do have a survey at the end of this webinar, which I would love you to fill in if you've got time. It's just 3 questions, just to make sure that when we're putting on these webinars that we're delivering content and information that's relevant and interesting to you. So please let us know what you'd like to hear about. As I said at the beginning of the webinar, this is National Science Week, so we have 2 more webinars happening this week. On Wednesday, we have a webinar on pain management and care with our CEO and Director, distinguished Professor David Adams, and also Janelle White from EPOC, the Pain Collaboration Unit over at Innovation Campus. So if you haven't yet registered for that, I encourage you to do so. I think it's a really interesting webinar. I'll put the link in the follow-up email that I send later today. And then on Thursday, we have a webinar highlighting and raising awareness for Huntington's disease. It's a neurodegenerative disease. It is quite rare, but we really want to let people know what's being done in this area. So we have Gabby Phillips, and we also have Robin Russell from the Huntington's Disease New South Wales ACT. So please register for that if you haven't already. Check out the National Science Week website for more interactive activities like this. And have a look at our website if you haven't already, imri.org.au. We have a newsletter as well that you can subscribe to in news. We send that out once a month to let you know all the different things that are going on at IHMRI, any events that we've got, and the research that's happening. So once again, look, thank you so much for dialing in today. It's been a real pleasure. Theresa, thanks again for giving us some of your time and for sharing your insights.
No worries. Have a good day.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you tomorrow. See you Wednesday, hopefully.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.